How Democracies Die by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt explores the decline of democratic systems, highlighting the threats democracies face from both within and outside their political institutions. The authors, political scientists with significant expertise in the study of authoritarianism and democratic resilience, argue that modern democracies are less likely to collapse through military coups or revolutions, as was common in the 20th century. Instead, they often die gradually through the erosion of democratic norms and institutions from within. The central thesis of the book is that the fragility of democracies today is less about institutional failures and more about the breakdown of shared democratic norms. Levitsky and Ziblatt explain that while the formal institutions of democracy, such as elections and constitutions, may still function, the erosion of key norms such as mutual toleration and forbearance can lead to the collapse of democratic governance. These norms, the authors argue, are what keep political rivals from becoming enemies and allow leaders to exercise power within agreed-upon limits. Without them, politicians may resort to undemocratic practices to gain an advantage. The two key norms, mutual toleration and forbearance. At the heart of the book are two norms that Levitsky and Ziblatt argue are essential for the survival of democracy: mutual toleration and forbearance. Mutual toleration is the idea that opposing political parties must accept each other's right to exist and compete for power. This means that politicians on opposing sides may disagree vehemently, but they must recognize that their rivals have a legitimate right to participate in the political process. Without mutual toleration, political parties may start to view each other as existential threats, which can lead to a breakdown in democratic cooperation. Forbearance, on the other hand, is the willingness of politicians to exercise restraint in the use of their powers, even when they have the legal right to do so. For example, a party in power may choose not to use its legal authority to crush political opposition, not because it lacks the legal right, but because doing so would violate democratic principles. This restraint is vital because the use of political power for partisan gain, such as packing the judiciary, undermining the media, or suppressing political opposition, undermines democratic institutions. The erosion of democratic norms. Levitsky and Ziblatt argue that democracy can gradually erode through the breakdown of these two norms. The authors trace the rise of authoritarian leaders in established democracies, demonstrating how leaders exploit institutional weaknesses and erode democratic norms. They note how political polarization can weaken mutual toleration, making it easier for one party to adopt an us versus them mentality. This mindset encourages politicians to treat rivals as enemies rather than legitimate political competitors, which can escalate conflict and undermine democratic institutions. In particular, the authors look at the case of the United States and the rise of Donald Trump. They argue that Trump's ascension to the presidency represented a dramatic breakdown in the political norms that have long underpinned American democracy. Trump's disregard for the established norms of political civility, his attacks on the media, and his undermining of the legitimacy of elections all signaled a deepening crisis for American democracy. By breaking these norms, Trump both encouraged political polarization and set a dangerous precedent for future leaders. The role of political parties. Levitsky and Ziblatt emphasize the central role that political parties play in safeguarding democracy. Political parties, they argue, are the primary gatekeepers in a democracy, responsible for selecting candidates who are committed to democratic norms. When political parties fail to uphold democratic values or allow extremist or authoritarian figures to rise to power, the integrity of democracy is at risk. The authors illustrate this argument by analyzing the behavior of political parties in various countries, including the United States, Venezuela, and Turkey. In each case, the authors show how political parties allowed or enabled the rise of authoritarian leaders, often because they prioritized short-term gains over long-term democratic stability. For example, in Venezuela, the political party system initially undermined democracy by failing to hold its leaders accountable, which paved the way for Hugo Chávez's rise to power. Similarly, in Turkey, the ruling AKP party eroded democratic norms in a bid to consolidate power, ultimately leading to the rise of authoritarianism. Levitsky and Ziblatt also explore the impact of party systems on the resilience of democracy. In some countries, the presence of strong, broad-based political parties that encompass a wide range of political views can help maintain democratic stability by promoting compromise and cooperation. In others, however, a fragmented party system can fuel polarization and make it easier for extremist factions to rise to prominence. The threats from populism and authoritarian leaders. One of the central themes in How Democracies Die is the role of populism in undermining democratic systems. Populist leaders, according to Levitsky and Ziblatt, often present themselves as champions of the people who seek to dismantle entrenched elites and corrupt political systems. While populism can be a powerful tool for mobilizing popular support, it can also be a danger to democracy when it undermines the democratic institutions that protect individual rights and political pluralism. The authors warn that populist leaders often engage in a democratic backsliding process in which they gradually weaken democratic norms and institutions while maintaining the formal structures of democracy. For example, populists may attack the judiciary, undermine the media, and suppress political opposition, all while claiming to act in the name of the people. In many cases, they exploit democratic institutions to secure and consolidate their own power, creating a facade of democracy that hides the erosion of its core principles. Levitsky and Ziblatt point to the examples of populist leaders such as Viktor Orban in Hungary and Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, who have exploited their positions to dismantle democratic checks and balances. Orban's government in Hungary, for instance, has systematically eroded judicial independence, curtailed press freedom, and marginalized opposition parties, all under the guise of maintaining democratic legitimacy. Similarly, Erdogan's regime in Turkey has cracked down on political opposition, imprisoned journalists, and purged the military, undermining the democratic institutions that once upheld Turkey's secular democracy. The importance of civic engagement. The authors also stress the importance of civic engagement in preserving democracy. While political parties and elites play a critical role in protecting democratic norms, it is ultimately the active participation of citizens that can prevent the erosion of democratic values. Civic engagement, including voting, peaceful protest, and participation in political dialogue, is crucial for maintaining a healthy democracy. Levitsky and Ziblatt caution that when citizens become disengaged or disillusioned with the political process, the foundations of democracy become more vulnerable. They argue that democratic resilience requires active involvement from citizens who hold their leaders accountable and demand that democratic norms be upheld. How Democracies Die offers a compelling analysis of the dangers facing contemporary democracies, focusing on the gradual erosion of democratic norms and the rise of populism and authoritarianism. Levitsky and Ziblatt argue that while formal democratic institutions may remain intact, it is the underlying norms of mutual toleration and forbearance that are essential to the survival of democracy. The book serves as a warning about the fragility of democratic systems and the need for citizens, political parties, and leaders to uphold the values that make democracy possible.